Welcome to the Alcohol ReThink Podcast, the podcast for men who are ready to rethink the role of alcohol in their lives for good. With shared experiences, concepts, tools and coaching, get ready to radically change how you think about alcohol and stop drinking for good. I'm your host, Patrick Fox. Let's go! Hi guys, and welcome to episode number 196 of the Alcohol ReThink Podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Really special episode for you today. And before we dive in, I just want to do a little celebration for myself and for the podcast, actually, because last week, before this came out, we hit 250,000 listens to the podcast, which is incredible. So the podcast started back in 2020, had a little hiatus in 21, brought it back. And now we're at 250,000 listens, which is really amazing. I just think about all of you listening, all of the changes that that's going to be creating for you, which is amazing. We're almost at 200 episodes. And so I've lined up some really cool guests. And today I'm joined by one of them. He is not new to the show. In fact, he's been a very popular guest on the show. He came back with us right back in episode number 28 and then again in episode 135. It's amazing to have him back on. He is the author of the very successful books Alcohol Explained 1 and 2, and now the new book, Nicotine Explained, is none other than Mr. William Porter.
Hello and congratulations. Wow, that's quite a number, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, man. Like I could see it was like ticking away to that, and 250,000 or 250,000. Yes, it rolls off the tongue rather nicely. So yeah,
Absolutely.
but it just shows, doesn't it, in what you're doing, what I'm doing, what so many other people are out there doing now as well, the impact that this work is having and how many more ears we've got when it comes, or eyes in your case, when it comes to learning about alcohol and the truth of it.
Yeah, it's interesting really, isn't it? Because I think things have definitely gone through quite a big change over the last few years where it's kind of, you know, maybe a decade or so ago, there was sort of AA or nothing. And it was kind of like you're either alcoholic in inverted commas or you're not, and if you're not, don't worry about it, carry on, but trying to control it a bit. And if you're alcoholic, you know, you're sort of pigeonholed in that category and you have to either stop drinking or God knows what. So but now people are approaching it in a completely different way and just looking at, you know, is it worth doing? Am I getting more out of this than I'm putting into it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a lot more curiosity about all of it. And like you said, it was the two, wasn't it? It's like you're either an alcoholic or you're just the normal quote unquote drinker and you just get on with it and try and control it. But if you couldn't control it, it meant you were an alcoholic. So you were just like stuck in this endless loop. And so that's definitely changing, whether we call it grey area drinking or just sober consciousness, I would say, more than anything, or alcohol consciousness.
Yeah, I think it's having a bit more cognizance to the downside as well, because I think there was kind of like a mistaken belief that, you know, if you're in the realm of inverted commas normal drinking, there's no real downsides to alcohol. But of course, the effect it has on our sleep, which impacts REM sleep and our mental health, the effect it has on our heart rate and blood pressure, which in turn affects our fitness and ability to exercise and just joie de vivre generally. You know, it has quite a big impact, even if you're someone who drinks normally.
Yeah, huge impact. Something that I come across, I don't diagnose this because obviously I'm not a doctor by any means, but, you know, that whole idea of anhedonia, so that experience of the loss of joy, and it comes up quite often. And so anyone who's listening is like a diagnosis for people who, after addiction, find it really challenging, find life very kind of black and white and dull and boring. And on the face of it, that kind of makes sense, right? Because everything that you've been doing up until that point has just been chaotic and splashes of color everywhere. But when you stop drinking, there can be that phase where you are recovering, essentially, right? Like your brain and your body are having to get used to it. So is that something you come across quite a lot as well?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, because I think the problem is when you're drinking sort of is the cherry on the cake for everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I mentioned sort of it before, but, you know, one of the aspects of all addiction, not just alcohol, is craving. Cravings, you know, a lot of people think of cravings as just something that happened to us, but it's actually a specific thought process where we start to obsess about something and think about it and fantasize about it. And of course, when you're doing that, you're not really engaged in what's going on. So, going out with mates, being on holiday, Christmas, these are all inherently enjoyable, but they're only enjoyable if you're concentrating in them and engaging in them. If you're distracted in some way, i.e. if you're thinking about shouldn't I, I'd be happy if I had a drink, etc., you can't really engage in what's going on. So when you get to that stage, alcohol almost takes on a life of its own. It almost becomes it doesn't actually do anything other than remove that thought process. So you might be on holiday and you just sat there not enjoying yourself because you're going through that mental thought process, and then you have a drink and it does nothing other than remove that thought process so you can actually enjoy what's going on. So in that way, it kind of becomes the difference between just sitting through life and actually enjoying it. And what you can find when you quit is you almost just hit that flat plateau of not having that. And I think the other thing is with any kind of chemical addiction, one of the things it allows you to do is to control what you're feeling and when. Okay, because forget all the downsides, all the supposed benefits, whatever. When you're drinking every day, you get to decide at this point, I will have a drink and I will feel good. It's the same as if you're smoking. You say, right, okay, I'm going to have a break at 10 o'clock, and you can go outside, have a cigarette, and it will give you that momentary boost. When you stop that chemical relationship, you have to find other ways to make yourself feel good. And a lot of the time it takes a bit of effort. It might be exercise or, meditation or relaxing or walking in nature, whatever it might be. But you don't have that easy tap that you can turn on and off to change how you're feeling.
Yeah. And often some of those things you mentioned, like, they require more effort, don't they? Like, you have to
Absolutely
get up
do.
and put your shoes on and get out of the house, whatever it may be. But whereas a drink, that you just crack open a can, open a fridge, whatever it may be.
It's particularly the case when it becomes that sort of habitual pressure release, like I'm saying, because if you're drinking every day and that's how you come home from work and relax, then you come home from work on day one, and instead, like I say, instead of relaxing and concentrating on takeaway you've got or the TV or whatever you're doing that evening, if you're kind of thinking, oh, I'd have a drink now, wouldn't it be nice? I'm not allowed one, blah, blah, blah. You're not engaging in the relaxation. And it kind of removes that from you.
Yeah. And it can be tricky to navigate during those times. And that's a conversation I have with a lot of guys I work with, or just anybody who wants to talk about not drinking, is being able to have a willingness to find something else to do. Almost like not drinking is the goal, or to radically reduce your drinking, whatever you're going for, but actually have another goal. I don't know, taking up some sort of hobby, habit, something that's almost going to distract you from the goal of not drinking. So it's almost like you've got two goals simultaneously going off, and they're to complement each other almost.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think what people sometimes miss, I was talking about how alcohol affects heart rate and blood pressure. It puts your heart rate and blood pressure up. And when that happens, your brain immediately jumps in and tries to calm everything down. So in short, it makes you very lethargic. You feel heavy and just tired. Also mention how alcohol impacts sleep. So it has a massive, when you drink, you may be unconscious, but you're not sleeping. You're not going through those restorative sleep cycles. So one of the sleep cycles is REM. It's massively important to our mental health. It's when we dream. Okay, just in terms of waking up and feeling good, you need to have a lot of REM sleep. Alcohol completely demolishes your ability to have REM sleep. So when you're drinking regularly, you're tired a lot. You get in from work and all you want to do is sit down in front of the TV. You open a drink, you have a drink. It doesn't really matter what's on the TV because you're exhausted anyway. You haven't slept properly for God knows how long. And then you're taking on board this sedative. So you'll be quite happily sat there slumped in front of whatever. But when you stop drinking, you start sleeping properly and you get a bit more energy, you'll find you're a bit more alert and you've got a bit more energy in the evening. And what a lot of people find is what would keep them entertained while they were drinking is no longer good enough for them now they're not, because frankly, a lot of the dross that's on TV isn't that entertaining unless you've had a sedative to knock you down a bit first.
Yeah.
So it can almost be like a double whammy, because one, you've stopped drinking and suddenly instead of sat down relaxing for the evening, you're just bored and restless. But I think that's something people need to get on board with, that you will have a bit more energy, you'll have a bit more mental focus in the evening. Your day doesn't just stop at 5 or 6 or whatever when you crack the beers open or the wine. So it's worth having a plan. It's worth having something, like you say, not just to distract you, but you've got those extra few hours of energy and focus, and you need to use them for something.
Yeah, it's really surprising how much time you get back of an evening. Like you don't, like if you finish work 5, 6 o'clock, you've still got 4, 5 hours sometimes before bedtime. Like, and if you've got kids, maybe that gets reduced a little bit. But generally speaking, like that's a lot of time.
It is. It's kind of like if you're like most people, and some people hate their jobs, some people hate their jobs less. I think most people, we're there for the money, right? You're not doing it for love of the job. So that's your time that evening. And like you say, it can be 4 or 5 hours. It's a fair chunk of the day. And certainly when I was drinking, that was almost like dead time. You almost didn't do anything. You just go home and drank, and you're sort of semi-comatose on the sofa. Whereas actually, in many ways, your day should be starting then. That's when you get to go out and do what you want to do for a bit.
Yeah. So since writing Alcohol Explained 1 and 2, right, and these books have had a massive, massive impact in the world. I mean, I actually listened to Alcohol Explained, and it's funny because before this interview, I was thinking about it, and I can remember exactly where I was when I was listening to it. The bit about sleep, funnily enough, right? I was in my local park and I was listening to it, and it was just like all of these jaw-dropping moments of clarity for me, which is amazing. But since having wrote them, has there anything changed in terms of your thinking around it, or what's some of the impacts that you heard back from them?
I don't think anything's changed as such. There's always, I always kind of struck by maybe new topics to cover or describing things in slightly different ways. So I'm always kind of circling around on that a bit. It's almost like, because obviously, I mean, I wrote Alcohol Explained probably 10 years ago now, and obviously I've changed a bit since then, and I've learned more about alcohol. And obviously there's been Alcohol Explained too, but it's almost like if I sat down to write it now, it probably would be a different book. But I don't think anything material was particularly changed in it. I think one of the big things is what we've spoken about in that the sober movement has got so big now. And like I say, it's no longer a question of, people are looking to stop drinking because they're drinking really, really heavily. Now you get a significant number of people that are drinking, particularly by UK standards, fairly moderately, but still, they realise that it's impacting their energy. They realise it's impacting their food choices and their diet. They realise it's impacting their energy and their fitness. And yet when they come to stop, it's maybe problematic. I'm not talking about from a physical perspective, but even people just have a couple of drinks on a Friday and Saturday night. When it comes to a Friday or Saturday night, something suddenly doesn't feel right. Doesn't quite feel the same without a drink. So they go back to it, and they kind of, although it's not that massive destructive cycle that people are on when they're very alcohol dependent, it's kind of like a much smaller, more modest version of it, where they kind of would rather not do it. They can't really enjoy themselves without it on a Friday, Saturday night. So they have a few drinks and they wake up feeling rotten the next day thinking, oh, I wish I hadn't bothered. It's kind of that similar cycle.
Yeah, and that, I guess that ties back to habits and also beliefs, right? So when you are going out, quite often from, I don't know, late teens, let's say, especially here in the UK, going out on the weekend would mean that you drank. For example, I dropped my daughter to a party at the weekend, and she's almost 17, and it was an 18-year-old birthday party. My daughter didn't want to drink because she had a rugby final the next day. And one of her friends or someone she knows goes, oh, are you drinking at the party? And she's like, no. And they were like, oh, that's boring. And I was just like, I'm really surprised that someone so young would still have that perception that it's boring not to drink.
It's interesting.
To not drink, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I read a statistic today. It's something like 28% of people, I can't remember the exact age, but under 18 are teetotal now. So that's nearly a third. So, the upcoming generation are very much sort of rejecting alcohol far more than we did as youngsters. So things are changing, and it's interesting. But I suppose that, there are still those beliefs. We're talking about percentages. So that's still like, what is it, like 72% of people under 18 do drink, or that age group, that younger age group. So it's still a significant number, but I think things are improving.
Definitely. And I kind of digress slightly there, but that was just an interesting conversation I had in the car. But what I was getting to was around the beliefs, and you go out every weekend and you're drinking, right? it's no wonder it feels weird to not be drinking. It's the same as like you get home and you watch telly and drink in front of the telly, right? Like it's no wonder it's going to feel different. And so there's the belief that alcohol is what makes things fun, which we spoke about tons of times before, but it really is a case of learning how to be comfortable in situations with not drinking a lot of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it all really comes down to social anxiety, doesn't it? I mean, we're all creatures of society, and when we're in social situations, most people have a degree of social anxiety. Obviously, the more introverted you are, the more social anxiety you have. But actually, the natural way is if you just sit and chat to someone, you eventually sort of relax into the evening, and you relax and you get an endorphin rush. So your brain releases endorphins when you're relaxed and socializing. So you get that endorphin rush. But like you said, if you're used to drinking does in the short term assist because you have to be relaxed and socializing. Now, there's two ways you can get that relaxation. You can just wait a bit until you relax into the situation and it happens that way. Or you can take a sedative like alcohol, which being a depressant will take the edge off the nerves. So it does have that. It doesn't necessarily give you anything you wouldn't have got anyway, but it just gives it to you a bit quicker. But the problem is, you're right, when you've got that belief, you can't then relax in a social situation, because if you're approaching a social situation with the mindset that I need alcohol to enjoy, because I did this loads of times when I was drinking, for one reason or another, I'd be the designated driver and I'd almost turn up with like just have to wait for the evening to end and move on to the next social occasion when I'm not driving so I can actually enjoy myself. But you're actually kind of looking at it as a penance. And you're not relaxed, you're kind of wishing it would end or you could have a drink or whatever. Of course you don't enjoy yourself. But that's perfectly natural because you're not relaxed, you're not engaging in the conversation. You're kind of, like I say, just waiting for it to be over. But user experience then is, well, I enjoy social situations when I'm drinking, but I don't enjoy them when I'm not drinking. And then it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, it being that like the cherry on the cake. You know, it's not quite the same without alcohol. And at that point, it's really just a placebo. And I get that, you know, there's a physical side to it as well for a lot of drinkers. But that particular aspect, it is purely placebo. It's just going into it, like you say, with that mindset that it's not going to be much fun because I'm not drinking. And of course it isn't. And it's not a question of anything so airy-fairy as kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's an actual chemical reason for it. If you are not relaxed and enjoying yourself, you don't get that endorphin rush that you get when you are relaxed and enjoying yourself.
Yeah. It kind of works twofold there, doesn't it? So one, in your example of being a designated driver, is you actually deny yourself a good night out because you think you're not drinking, so it therefore can't be fun, which is kind of just crazy when you think about it. But then secondly, it's such an unfair comparison, isn't it? To go, but this isn't as fun as when I'm drinking, because really you can't compare anything to alcohol just because of what it does. And like you say, because of the chemical reaction that it has in your own brain and body.
Yeah, exactly. You see a similar thing as well with like sometimes with dry January. There was a chap at work who was doing dry January and he was like, I was overhearing the conversation and someone said to him, "Oh, do you want to go out for a drink tonight?" And he went, "No, I'm not going out. I'm doing dry January." And like, fair enough, he's doing dry January, but he's just not going out. He's just refusing to do anything. And it's almost worse in a way because all you're doing is instilling in yourself how boring it is to be sober, because you'll forever think back to January and think, God, that was boring. I didn't do anything. It's horrible. But it's kind of like self-imposed, isn't it? So the idea is not just to give up alcohol. It's what you were talking about before. It's learning, or rather relearning, to enjoy life without alcohol. And the reason I say relearning is because, you know, you talked about most people start drinking mid-late teens. But before that, we all socialised. We went to kids' parties, we met up with mates and we enjoyed ourselves. We didn't need alcohol to enjoy ourselves. But it's only when you introduce alcohol into the equation that you suddenly find, well, not suddenly, but over a period, you find you can't quite enjoy yourself without it.
Yeah, it's funny because I can look at my 7-year-old boy, nearly 8, and they have no problem interacting with each other, right? Like they come up with games, they can play. And I know, of course, like adolescence, that does change somewhat anyway because of puberty and whatever. But I definitely think like the introduction of alcohol or weed, which is obviously very popular here in the UK as well, like all of these things just start distorting your view of what's normal and what's not, basically.
Yeah, and like I say, all of these substances, they introduce that kind of element that if you start to believe you need it to enjoy yourself in social occasions or other occasions, then of course it kind of poisons it and you don't enjoy yourself unless you've got it because you're distracted by it.
So what, and actually that reminded me, so football for me, right? I used to watch a lot of football when I was drinking. I don't watch that much football anymore, funnily enough, right? Because it's almost like football was the excuse to just sit there and drink or go out and drink or whatever it may be. And I'm sure everyone can relate to some form of doing something which is centered around alcohol. But for me, yeah, football just, I watch it now, but I don't feel about it the same way that I did when I was drinking at all.
Yeah, do you know, so I go to, I've got a season ticket for Fulham, so I go quite regularly.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, I got into it after I'd stopped drinking. Interesting. I was never
Nice.
that into it. But I take your point. I think there's a few things where for me it was almost like the point of it was drinking. And if you remove the drinking, I wasn't particularly interested in it. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of the difference because, you know, for me, drinking was enjoyable. So you could give me something that I was fairly ambivalent about, but as long as there was alcohol involved, I'd go along and enjoy it because I was drinking. So I think when you stop drinking, you can have that dynamic where some of the things you might engage in regularly are actually you don't enjoy that much. You might need to change what you're doing and actually do stuff that you do enjoy. I think a rule of thumb, if you need a sedative, loads and loads of sedative in order to do something, it's probably not quite pushing the right buttons for you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it sounds so bizarre when you say it out loud, and that's cool though. That for you, going to football was something that came after drinking. Like I still go to football. I enjoy it when I'm there, but I'm just not obsessed by it like I was when I was drinking alcohol.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting dynamic, I think, with concerts and sporting events.
Yeah,
Certainly, this is my experience of it, and I've spoken to an awful lot of people who concur. You have this idea, oh, it'd be great. We go to the football and have a few drinks, or we're going to go and see so and so in concert, and we'll get the drinks in and blah blah blah. We're going to go and see a comedian or something, and it's like, oh, fantastic. We'll have a few drinks before and during the interval. What actually happens is one of two things. One, you end up drinking too much and not remembering it at all, and not really following what's going on. Or even if you don't get to that level, what I used to end up doing, and a lot of people agree with this, like, so you get there, you're queuing at the bar's rammed, so you're queuing at the bar for ages to get a drink, you get the drink, you get to your seat, and then you need the toilet. And then by the time you've been to the toilet, you want another drink, so you're off to the bar again. And then, you know, for football, you're kind of waiting for half time. But after the first 15 minutes, you're kind of clock watching. And then, you know, you see people leaving in droves before like 5 minutes before half time to get to the bars to get a drink before it gets too rammed. And it's like, you're not actually enjoying the match, are you? You spend your time, concerts, football, whatever. You spend your time either trying to get a drink or trying to get rid of a drink in the toilet. And that's if you don't drink so much, you don't really remember it the next day anyway.
I went to a Six Nations game last year, I think it was, which was great, but at the same time, it was a pain in the arse because every time you sat down, you'd have to stand up again within like a minute or two because people would just because you can drink in the stands at rugby, of course, and so there was just a constant flow of people going to the bar, people going to the toilet, all those things you just described, and being there as a non-drinker. It did get a little bit annoying after a while. It's just like, oh, come on, man. And there's like Guinness all over the floor because people are just spilling it. Because they buy like 3-4 beers, right? I know you used to do it. You buy loads of beers so you don't have to go back to the bar, but then someone kicks them over or a chair knocks them or do you know what I mean? It's just chaos.
Yeah. Jeez.
So since Alcohol Explained 1 and 2 has come out, what are you now doing differently as a result? I mean, getting on a ton of podcasts, of course.
I'm not sure I'm doing a massive amount differently, to be honest. I kind of wrote the books and just sort of got on with things. I mean, from a personal perspective, I'm going through a divorce at the moment, which is difficult. So that's kind of been an interesting thing. And it's kind of been a relief in a way because thinking about if I'd been drinking, I'm sure I'd be going off the rails quite badly at the moment. So it's kind of like interesting because it's one of those things where you can't, it's one of the typical things where people do go off the rails with alcohol if they, you know, get divorced or lose their job or whatever. So it's kind of interesting negotiating that without drinking. And I think ordinarily I stopped drinking and my life didn't change massively other than for the better. So I was sleeping well. I was getting up and going for a run in the morning and going to the gym, and it was all fairly okay. But since this has happened, it's kind of been a lot tougher. And I've had to rethink. I've started running every day now just because I find it gives me that extra boost. So I've shortened my runs a bit just so I can go every day, which helps. But like I say, a lot of the time with alcohol, because it's a sedative, you get into using it to manage difficult feelings. You know, you don't feel good, so you drink alcohol and it helps to dampen them down and you can sort of disassociate from those unpleasant feelings. So quitting drinking when you're feeling okay is one thing. Obviously, it has its own challenges. But when things are going very badly and you're used to using alcohol to kind of take the edge off the bad times, that's when it becomes a bit more difficult. And I think that's one of the things I would always say to people who are thinking of cutting down drinking, stopping drinking, short or long term or whatever. It's to make sure you've got, I refer to them as like coping mechanisms. You know, what are you going to do when the times get tough? Because what you don't want to do is suddenly find yourself in a difficult situation and you're like, oh, well, it's all right, I'll have a drink oh, I'm not drinking. And suddenly you're kind of like, it's almost like you've got two hits at the same time. So whatever's going on is causing you a problem and your go-to solution suddenly isn't available anymore. So you need to get those things kind of in place beforehand. And I think the problem with drinking is because, you know, by its very nature, we're consuming something to change how we feel. So there's a natural tendency just to move on to something else to consume, consume to change how you feel, like caffeine, nicotine, drugs, fast food, whatever, which all have, needless to say, quite massive downsides and a very superficial boosting effect. And to try and sort of purposefully adopt more beneficial coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about that, man. And thank you for sharing, because I think it raises a really great point about why or how people drink, you know. And so when adversity does come along, as you just mentioned, that people drink because they want to change how they feel. I was just, as you were sharing, I was wondering how much of it is that they know alcohol is going to change how they feel, or how much of it is it almost like learned behavior or conditioning of seeing others doing something similar, right? Like in the movies or in books, or, you know, how much of that is, and maybe there's no real answer here, but it is an interesting point, isn't it? In terms of like, do we know it's actually going to change how we feel, or are we doing it because that's what we think we should be doing when we feel that way?
That's a really good point. And my 2p worth for what it's worth is I think when we start drinking early on in our lives, it's probably the fact that it's learned. So, you know, you're watching TV and people have a difficult day and they pour a drink or they have an argument. You know, people use it all the time as stress relief. And if not on TV, mostly our adult role models are doing exactly that. So from a very young age, we're being taught when something difficult happens, here's the solution. But I think that's very quickly reinforced by our own experience because it is a sedative. So it does have that immediate effect of kind of taking the edge off things. Now, one of the interesting things, I mean, everyone knows, oh, it doesn't solve your problems. And then you wake up the next day feeling worse, blah, blah, blah. But what a lot of people don't realize is alcohol actually has two effects on us, really. It gives us that feeling of relaxation and sedation, and it leaves us feeling intoxicated, right? And most people just think of that as the effects of alcohol. But actually, it's very useful to separate them out and think of them as two very different processes. So on the one hand, you've got the relaxation, and on the other hand, you've got the sedation or intoxication that comes with it. Now, the reason it's important to divide them out is because they run their course at different times. Okay, so if you have a drink, the relaxation effect wears off way quicker than the intoxication effect, right? So let's say you've had a bad day or you're out with friends or whatever the reason, you want to have that, call it bars or relaxation or whatever you want to call it, from 2 drinks, right? So you have those 2 drinks and for 10, 15 minutes, you feel pretty good, right? So at that moment, you're 2 drinks relaxed and 2 drinks intoxicated, okay? After 15 minutes or so, the relaxation has worn off. So you need to have a couple more drinks. You have 2 more drinks, okay? You're now still 2 drinks relaxed, but the intoxication hasn't run its course yet. That's still going strong. So you're actually 4 drinks intoxicated. And as the evening goes on, as you're constantly drinking, you're chasing that feeling of relaxation, but you're getting increasingly intoxicated. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why a lot of people, particularly when they've been drinking a while, find it increasingly hard to stay sober, because as they're chasing that feeling of relaxation, they're getting more and more intoxicated. But the reason I'm mentioning it specifically with talking about damping down emotions is because that intoxicating effect has a particularly marked effect on a part of our brain called the limbic system. Okay, so the limbic system is very, very prone to sedation by alcohol. Okay, now one of the things the limbic system does is it calms emotions down when they're triggered. So how emotions happen in the brain is something happens and it fires it off, but the limbic system jumps in and calms it down. Okay, so I think the example in the book I give, like you break a coffee cup and you like lose your temper, but it's a cup and it happens and you've got the rest of the day to get on with. So the limbic system jumps in and calms you down. It's all fine. When you've been drinking alcohol, because the limbic system very easily becomes sedated by the alcohol, it can't do its job. So what happens when you drink alcohol? Alcohol tends to let emotions just run amok. And that's why there's that massive correlation between drinking and violent crime, and why when people are drinking, they can become very argumentative and very violent. You're literally dealing with toddlers who haven't slept very well, and their emotions are they just cannot control their emotions.
Yeah.
So this
Let's
is why
face it,
we
that's
end
not
up
much
with
fun.
this. Yeah, but this is why we end up with this weird anomaly, because like you immediately think, I've had a stressful day, or I've had an argument, I'm going through a difficult time, I'm going to reach for a drink to take the edge off it. But we also know drunk people are really emotionally unstable. You know, it's people crying into their glasses at the end of the evening and texting exes at 4 a.m. and all the rest of it. All that comes down to this limbic system being really open to the intoxicating effects of the alcohol. So you end up with this weird situation where we know that alcohol has a negative effect on our emotions and it makes us more emotive, but we still reach for a drink to manage our emotions. So you kind of end up with that weird anomaly. And I think that's one of the many reasons I'm never tempted to drink, even going through this difficult period, because I know I'd have a few minutes of sedating or kind of numbing the effect. Very shortly after that, it wouldn't be working anymore, because as the limbic system became sedated, that emotion would just run off the rails completely. Then got a very bad night's sleep and waking up 10 times worse in the morning. So however bad I'm feeling now, yes, it would be very tempting to have something to take the edge off it, but I kind of know that alcohol's not that thing.
Yeah, that's so fascinating as well. So for a lot of guys I speak to or work with, there's this idea that, or not an idea, but we're not in touch with our emotions, and you might even be able to recognize this. But like hearing you say that it's not true, is it? It's actually, we're very in touch with our emotions because they come out when we're drinking. It's just that when we're not drinking, that's when we're trying to suppress them and keep them away. And so when you drink, like they come out, they're there. When you're not drinking, you're trying to block them. And when you stop drinking, that's when they start bubbling up again. And that can be really uncomfortable, right? Like, because all of a sudden you're like, why am I crying about this thing on this advert on TV? Or, you know, like,
Yeah.
or like what always gets me now, especially since having kids, is like anything to do with kids and like their parents, not whatever, right? Like a million different things. Like that always gets me now. Like in the past, I wouldn't even thought about it. Yeah, really interesting just in terms of, like, we think we're not in touch with our emotions. In fact, we are, but we're just suppressing them, with sedating them. It's like, it's paradoxical, isn't it? Like we're trying to sedate our emotions, but actually we become more emotional in a degree.
Yeah, I mean, again, this might just be me, but for what it's worth, my take on it is, you know, people say English people very stiff upper lip, very, very bad at showing their emotions. It's really bad for you because you hold it all down, kind of like we should be walking around hugging each other and crying all the time. But for what it's worth, I think there's different ways of dealing with emotions. And I think British people, not just English people, English, Scots, Welsh, the way we quite often, particularly men, the way we deal with emotions is humour. Okay, we joke about stuff and we make light of it. And to my mind, that's not a bad way of dealing with it. It's better than drinking. And we might not go around like certain other nationalities screaming and shouting and getting really emotional or crying in public and all the rest of it. But we definitely display humour. And I think that's a perfectly valid way of dealing with emotions.
Yeah. Humour is definitely my go-to. No coincidence we're laughing right now.
Yeah.
All right, wicked. William, amazing. Thank you so much for coming back on the show, mate. Just before we go, could you just speak to Nicotine Explained for a few moments? Because I know that's something that's come out fairly recently.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it was a sort of similar thing with nicotine that I did with alcohol, which is just kind of pick it apart a bit, which is obviously a lot more difficult with nicotine because of Alan Carr's Stop Smoking books. So I don't know if you're familiar with those, but Alan Carr wrote, obviously for me, was very much the front runner in kind of analysing addiction. So it made it quite difficult, but I tried to sort of pick out some new stuff that wasn't in his books, which I think is particularly relevant because a lot these days you're talking less about smoking and more about vaping or nicotine pouches. So you kind of got into this weird realm where it's almost like you can be heavily addicted to nicotine, taking it regularly, but never have to take a puff of a cigarette. So you're then looking more into the actual effects of the nicotine rather than the wider cigarette piece. So what's the nicotine actually doing for you? How does it feel when you take it, when it wears off? And interestingly, nicotine does a similar thing to alcohol, which is massively increased heart rate and blood pressure, which totally demolishes your energy levels, which is one of the big immediate things, which a lot of people just don't realize how much different they feel even within a few hours of quitting in terms of like, I don't feel quite so heavy. So yeah, hopefully it's sort of opened up a few new topics on the subject.
Nice. Yeah. And I think, when we look at addiction in general, like whatever the substance, I think there's a lot of parallels in that respect in terms of heart rate and what's it doing for you? That's such a beautiful question that you just asked there, because whether it's alcohol, whether it's nicotine, vaping, porn, whatever, gambling, what's it doing for you? Because there's an intelligence as to what it's doing, and if you can find out what that is, and then you can do something about it that doesn't involve having to take something else in order to solve.
Yeah, I think so. Something like 98% of our decision making is subconscious. So it's only 2% that you actually drag into your conscious brain and sort of work through. We're very used to allowing decisions to be made automatically. And that's very much true with addiction, because when you take these substances, rightly or wrongly, they do have an immediate effect that makes you feel better, usually, particularly when you're addicted to them and you're withdrawing, you have them and you make you feel good. That subconscious part of your brain's always directing you to keep taking it because I don't feel good. How can I feel better? Well, I just have to consume this cigarette or this vape or this drink and I immediately feel better. So for me, certainly getting to grips with it was pulling all of that subconscious stuff out into the open and sort of going through it methodically and kind of deciding actually, is this right or wrong? And really that's what it comes down to. It comes down to dragging everything out the subconscious and kind of going through it methodically and stopping your brain making automated decisions on it and actually taking that back that decision making process.
Yeah. So did you stop smoking after you stopped drinking?
No, I stopped smoking before I stopped drinking.
Okay.
So that was a while ago, but there were a few nuances, I think, because I stopped smoking and ended up going back to it because I was living with an American friend who introduced me to dip, which is like moist chewing tobacco, which was a bit unusual. And then when I was in the parachute regiment and was serving with the Americans, again, they were doing it. So I got quite into dip, which is interesting because when you're doing dip, in a way, it makes it much more easier to see the actual effects of the nicotine. Because when you're smoking a cigarette, you're just smoking and it's like smoking's enjoyable in and of itself. But when you're just doing it through another method, like a pouch or having it in your mouth, you can really notice the effects of the nicotine without any other kind of things on it. So it really helped to open my eyes to some of the effects of nicotine.
Amazing. All right, dude. Well, I just want to thank you for coming back. You might be my most regularly visited guest at this stage, which is fantastic. Like, you're definitely a veteran, mate, and you're a absolute legend in the sober world. So thank you for coming on, and it's great to see you again, man.
Yeah, nice to see you. Thank you for inviting me again.
Nice. If anyone wants to find out where to go to learn about what you're doing, where you hang out, where would they go?
alcoholexplained.com is usually the best place. The first 5 chapters of the first book are on there, so you can have a read of that. And
yeah, go do it. It's worth it. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you again, William, and take care. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.
Everyone, bye.